We're going to begin tonight with the Tosafos on the Gemara we learned yesterday. So we broke down the story of yesterday into three sections, 3 parts of the story. The first is Ravina's demand that Runya pay. The second is Ravina eliciting from Runya a reaction. And then 3, Rava's psak, that you should give him to be Matthias, because if not, you're going to have to pay the full amount. And the bottom line of our discussion is 2 things. Number 1, there's a chiddush din here that in order to be Machayev, the guy in the middle, he has to have Gilui Das, because Ravina didn't take him to court till then. And today, when I was looking in the back here, I saw that Pepula Charifta says a similar thing. So Baruch Shekivanti, it's gratifying to see that. That's number 1. Number 2, there's Rava's psak, which is the real reason l'chora why this comes up, to tell us that we pass like Rav Huna in the name of Rabbi Yossi. That's the way Rashi worded it. Rav Huna libe Rabbi Yossi. Rav Huna in the name of Rabbi Yossi. Now, reading it that way, then Rav Huna is the primary person about whom we were paskening, but Rav Huna the way he touches Rabbi Yossi, meaning to say, this is the way we were learning. But Rav Huna is saying, the premise of Rav Huna, like the Gemara starts before Rav Huna even speaks in the Gemara before, is Loishna Nikif, Loishna Makif. Doesn't matter who puts it up. And therefore, even though Ravina is the guy on the outside, he still has to pay. But how much does he have to pay? Then we say, I'll live with Rabbi Yossi. Because Rabbi Yossi says you pay Lefi Mashagadar rather than Meikonim Bezoil. Because Rav Huna, like a Tanakama, would be Meikonim Bezoil. Right? But then if we go even further, even deeper, and we understand that the story with Ravina and Rav Runya is not the same thing as our Gemara. We saw this, first of all, as the Mishnah and the Gemara before. We saw this in the Rashba, where he says that the Mishnah and the Gemara earlier is talking about where the person builds 1 wall at a time, whereas Ravina is talking about where he builds all 4 at a time. This is the case of Ravina, and therefore said the Rashba, even Rab Chia would agree in the case of Ravina that the Runya, the guy in the middle, the Nikif, would have to pay for his share. But Rab Chia would say he's limited to make Konim Bezol. And therefore you have Rav Huna, which says, no, you pay Hakol of Mashagada, you pay the full amount of what you paid. Now we're taking this same inyan from the Rashba and pushing it even further. Because if we're going to learn in Rashi as we did in the past, that the Gemara and the Mishnah before is talking about the inyan of Hezekriya, whereas the story of Ravina and Runya and Ravina is talking about keeping away Shmira from Regel and Shena Behemoths. So it's mamish 2 different cases. But nonetheless, from the fact, and this is why the first element of the story is Negeah, from the fact that Ravina B'chlal demanded that he pay the highest amount, he couldn't extract it from it because he never had Gilei Das. But the fact that Ravina demanded that he pay the highest amount, and then later Rava says, "Apayis v'loy da'inelach dino k'Ravuna libed Rabbi Yossi." That alone is a raya. That alone is a raya that we say Hakol Lefi Mashagadar, and that's the chiddush din here, because considering the fact that like the Rashba said, it's a different case. So even Rabbi Barav would say, even Rabbi Barav would agree that you paid Meikonim Bezoil. Rav Huna is Mechadish, and this is like Meduyik in Rashi's words, which puts Rav Huna before Rabbi Yossi. Rav Huna live with Rabbi Yossi, which the Chiddush there is, like Rashi says, the Amar Lefi Mashagadar, as opposed to saying Lefi Shemagalgal of Asakoil, because even Rabbi Barav and Tanakama would agree that in this case, Megalgal of Asakoil, because all 4 were built at once, and it's built to prevent animals from coming in. And Rabbi was only arguing b'negea to Hezekriya, where it's 1 at a time. We're putting 1 wall up at a time. So the Iker Chiddush of Rav Huna, Ali b'Rav Yossi, is that Amar Hakol Lefi Mashagadar. And considering that this is what Ravina demanded, and the Nova backs it up, then that means we have to be following Rav Huna. And therefore, we can deduce that even in the last Gemara, we also follow Rav Huna. Because we're demanding Hakol Lefi Mashagada. Okay, hope that was somewhat clear. Kind of a recap of where we were, what we were thinking yesterday. So now let's look at the Tosafos.
You can't exactly deduce from the first case because the first case is 3 walls, not all 4.
Right, but the Mishnah says 3 walls. When we inferred, what would it then be in 4 walls? Oh,
right, but you can't. But then you're not going to reverse engineer it back to when it was only 3 walls.
You're right. Only with the fact that, by what right is Ravina demanding Hakol Lefi Mashagada? The only right he could be doing to demand that is because it's Rav Huna. And if Rav Huna's din is good enough in his case, then that means you paskin like him universally. The pashtus. That's the
okay, but not necessarily for all 4 walls.
Why not? Rav Huna,
Well,
Rav Yosi says
say that he like Rashi.
Right?
Yeah, but for the first 3 walls, it could be already.
That's only Tanakama. That's the opinion of Tanakama according to Rabbi Barav. Rabbi Yosi, the only way you can say Rabbi Yosi would say you don't pay here is if you go with the version that Rabbi Yosi says only nikif. If Rabbi Yosi's din is limited to nikif, then Taka he's put here because over here Ravina built it and Ravina is the makif. But Kapayel, it's Rav Huna libud Rabbi Yosi, and Rav Huna says loishno nikif, loishno makif. Right?
But the whole argument is built that no one's going to argue once he builds all 4. When he builds all 4 walls in the beginning.
Yes, right from the start, correct. But even there's no reason to say Rabbi Barav would say you pay any more than to make Kanam Bezoil. Right?
Okay.
But so in other words, so the only certain reason to be demanding to pay Hakol Lefi Mashagada is if you're like Rav Huna, even though it's not the same case as Rav Huna. But Rav Huna is the only opinion which says that in all the scenarios described before. Meaning, even if you're going to go with the fact that Rabbi Barav says that in the case when you do one at a time, you don't pay all 4, and we're going to assume that Rabbi Barav would agree that in this case, because you're putting all 4 at once, you are paying for all 4, but there's no reason to take it further and say Rabbi Barav somehow says in this case you're paying Lefi Mashagada. You would say you're paying for all 4, but Lefi Dvei Kanim Bezol, because that's been consistently his opinion. The only way to go as far enough to say is Hakol Lefi Mashagada is Rav Huna. Alibud Rabbi Yosi, which says Loishno Nikif, Loishno Makif. Right? But even the Loishno Nikif, Loishno Makif is not nearly the Negeya here. Well, actually, it is Negeya here because in this case, it's only the Makif because you're doing all 4 at once. Right? But maybe Rabbi would agree over here because it's Shein Behemis. Right? Or because it's all at once, like the Rashi said. But nonetheless, he wouldn't say Hakol Lefi Mashagada. And that, I think, is why Rashi, when he quotes Rabbi Yosi, doesn't say the Omar Megalgal of Sakol and Hakol Lefi Mashagada. Just go straight to Hakol Lefi Mashagada. Because it's possible that in this case we're all 4 building at once. And the issue is Shein B'Regel Behemis, that even Rabbi agrees that you pay all 4, but just not Hakol Lefi Mashagada, you only pay the Mekon and Bezah. Okay. Clear? Okay, so let's see this Tosafos. Tosafos quotes the Gemara, which says that Rava said, if you don't accept the idea of paying, if you don't accept the idea of paying the minimal amount, I'm going to make a din Torah for you, and I'm going to paskin Rav Huna libud Rabbi Yosi. We're going to follow Rav Huna and Rabbi Yosi where you're paying the most. Now, this Tosafos, by the way, is really going to back up what I was saying yesterday, and it's really the piece that I left open, which is I kept on saying that it's Ravina, by Ravina's demand, that proves that's taka the halacha, not by Rav's psak, or I should say, after Ravina's demand, now you know that Rav's psak is taka a real psak, and that you really need to pay that amount, because Rav's wording itself is very odd. He's telling him, get away with paying less, unless I'll make you pay more. Like, which psak isn't? But with Ravina's introduction, Ravina demanding for the whole amount, that proves that it's taka din to pay the full amount. And you're going to see from Tosafos even further to my point, to this point. So let's see. Says Tosafos, it would seem somewhat. It's an interesting language. Ravina wasn't just threatening him to scare him into paying. But he was actually telling him he was actually giving him a credible threat. That taka the halacha would be you'd have to pay for the kolafi mashagada. You'd have to pay for the full amount of half the wall. As opposed to just giving him idle threats to make him pay the minimal amount. Because there is such a thing, there is precedent for this idea of threatening a litigant with hyperbole. And as Taisha says, because from the fact that the Rava doesn't say other forms of hyperbole to scare the guy, which the Gemara does elsewhere. So Taisha gives two examples elsewhere in the Gemara where a psak is given, and the Rav uses hyperbole, I think, where the Rav uses hyperbole. The Rav exaggerates to scare the guy to make him pay. How does he exaggerate? Two different examples. One is where he says, "V'lo, if you don't pay up, magvina la panda minach. We're going to go down to your mansion and start stealing your furniture." It's an expression basically to say you got to pay up, otherwise we're going to come down there and drag it out of you. And that's a threat. That's not a psak. So if Rava was just trying to threaten him and say, you better pay, otherwise I'm going to make it worse for you, then he should have used that threat. I'm going to come down to your house and take your stuff. That's the usual way of threatening. Or another threat, machinalach, we're going to hit you. Bisilua with thorns, the loy mavoy dama that doesn't cause you to bleed. In other words, they're going to beat you until you pay. So, says Tosafos, from the fact that Rava does not use these threats, but rather threatens him by saying that I'm going to make you pay more, is a raya that he actually means it, you will pay more. So you already see it from Tosafos, and from the fact that Tosafos says, Tzas hayanira, it would seem that it's very possible to learn the Gemara, and he's basing it basically on my question. Our question yesterday was, what kind of psak is this? Rav is giving the guy legal advice. So Tosafos is saying, in theory, you could have learned the Gemara. That means that the psak din really is you only pay aga natira. You only pay for the minimal amount. Rav said, if not, I'm going to make you pay more. It was a threat to make him pay up. But Tosafos says, I'm not so convinced that's correct, because if you want to threaten him, he would use another language. He would use language of I'm going to go to your house and take it, or use language of I'm going to hit you, we're going to beat you. But you can see in Tosafos already that there's room for this idea that Rav is not taka paskin like Rav Huna in the name of Rabbi. He's only saying it to threaten him to make him pay for the minimal amount. But says Tosafos, it seems to be that lav dafke, that maybe taka this is a real psak. See, Tosafos himself is bouncing on like, is this taka a real psak or not? Now, Tosafos goes further. The next part Tosafos we can put in parentheses, but we're just going to read through it. Now, the Bava Hagazel, even though in the Perek Lulav Hagazel and Sukkah, the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel Lahanu de Mizavni Asa. There were people who were selling Hadassim, they were selling Lulav and Esrik. So Shmuel came to them and said, Ashvu Zvinaychu, lower your prices. Basically, it's Erev Sukkah, so they're taking advantage, and they're charging much more than the going rate. So Shmuel said, Ashvu means, Ashvu means like to make even out your prices, that it should be even to the market value, not overpricing for sukkahs. V'loi, because if you're not going to do that, I'm going to pass like a tarfin. And a tarfin says that even a hadas, which is broken on the top, is mutter. Now, if a hadas which is broken on the top is mutter, then the price of hadas is going to drop, because it's much easier to get a hadas. So Shmuel threatened them and said, if you guys don't lower your prices, I'm going to undercut you by making it mutter for people to get cheaper hadassim. Now, the Gemara there concludes in Sukkah, that he was only scaring them, he was only threatening them. He wasn't actually, that the halacha does not follow Reb Tarfon. He was threatening him now that way. Now, that's the case where we see precedent for a Rav to use a higher halacha to threaten for a lower halacha, but it doesn't really hold by that halacha, right? Shmuel doesn't pass like Reb Tarfon. He's using it as a threat. So maybe here also, maybe when Rava says we pass like Rav Huna and Rabbi Yosi, it's not that that's actually the halacha. He's threatening him to make him pay for the cheaper price. So we're back to square one. Maybe that ayah is not. Maybe taka halacha is not like Rav Huna in the name of Rabbi Yosi. Maybe taka halacha is all you have to pay for is agar natira, which is why he told him to pay agar natira. He told him that if you don't, I'm going to make you pay more. It's a threat. A threat just to get him to pay, scaring him. And had we stopped here, this would be the answer to my question yesterday. He's not giving him legal advice. He's giving him a psak. But he's threatening him with a worse psak. Okay. But says Tosafos, and this is really what I was relying on yesterday, here in our Gemara, notwithstanding the fact that there's precedent from Sukkah where he's enforcing one psak by threatening with another. But over here, Nira, the Hachi Svirele, that he taka paskins that way. Why? Can the Pirish Rashi as Rashi teaches? Where is Rashi proving it? We know Rashi teaches it, right? The first Rashi says, Havli kama the Gidri, Rav Huna libid Rabbi Yosi. So the Omar, like the third line from the top of the page on the right hand side, Hey Amad Aleph, the Rashi, Havli kama the Gidri, when Ravina asks Runya to pay up. So Rashi explains, Rav Huna libid Rabbi Yosi, the Omar called him Mashagadar. We explained this at length yesterday. The Hachi Kamon Kedemuchel Kaman. Because this is taka halacha as is proven later. So Rashi does taka teach that way. But why hacha nida? Why is Tosafos saying that in this? Why is Tosafos giving in? He doesn't explain why. He adds another reason. Va'oid, another raya why I think that it's taka halacha. Before we get to the va'oid, how is Rashi's pshat convincing Tosafos? Or he's just accepting Rashi's pshat blindly? Tosafos want to continuously argue with Rashi. But over here, hacha nida, the hachi svirlik in the Pirish Rashi. Why hacha nida? Why so? And I think the answer comes from what I was saying yesterday, what I was saying earlier. From the fact that Rashi puts his psak not on the words of Rava. In other words, he doesn't wait till Rava and then he says, oh, you see from Rava's psak that the halacha is like Rav Huna and Rabbi Yosi. He puts it by Ravina. Because the fact that Ravina demanded it, that itself is halacha. And then the fact that Ravina demanded it is proof that when Rava said, if you don't pay up the small amount, I'm going to make you pay the full amount, it's proof that it's taka the halacha. But how do we know that Rava taka means it la halacha? Because Ravina asked for it lachatchila. And there's the raya from Rashi. From Rashi's formulation, the very fact that he puts the psak din in the words of Ravina means that Ravina's demand itself is a reason to paskin. Is enough of a reason that the Gemara can prove. And it's further backed up by the fact that Rava says, if you don't, I'm going to make you pay that way. Because had Rava said, just pay the minimal amount, then you could say, Machlekes Ravina and Rava. Ravina says you pay the full amount, and Rava says you pay the less amount. But the fact that Rava said, pay the small amount, and like Rashi says, only because only because he was agreed to accept it, but the halacha is higher. And this is all backed up by the fact that Ravina himself demanded that higher level, that higher payment. And that I think is what Tosafos means when he says that it's hacha nida kedepirish Rashi. And this explains why you have to have all three parts of the story to substantiate the halacha. Side Ravina's demand, the chiddush din of Gili Das, and then when Rava tells him to pay the minimum amount, that itself means that when Ravina asked for the higher amount, he was in full right to do so. But Nisratza to take less. Ulai. Then finally, says Tosafos, but additionally, another reason to say that over here it's a psak din and not just a threat with a worse psak din, but it's actually a psak that you would pay for the full amount. Why? From the fact that he told him, go take the money that was appeased to you. This indicates, like what Rashi said, because not because minadin you pay this little. Mashma says Tosafos, minadin really you should have paid more. If not for the fact that Ravina himself gave in. Which means like this. And Tosafos is giving us more words to explain our question yesterday. It means like this. Had Ravina demanded lechatchila, I want you to pay the full amount. And then Runya rejected. And then later, Ravina tested him by sending his artists to go take the money. And Runya yelled. And Ravina says, nope, but now you're proving you like it. Gilei das. Now we're going to Din Torah. What would Rava say then? Rava would say, pay the full amount. Because Ravina was never in his bias. Before you got here, Ravina accepted that he was going to be happy with a little amount of money. And therefore you can get away with that. I'm speaking this out, but I'm still not 100% sure, because when you go to Din Torah, then all of a sudden the previous Hayol v'Nisrat L'Kach falls away. Why? If Hayol v'Nisrat L'Kach is a credible halachic reason to make him pay less than he's worthy of paying, then why isn't that admitted into Din Torah also? Right? Ravina doesn't come. We have no indication that Ravina is coming demanding for full payment. If anything, he's coming for payment for protection against goats. That's the part of the story just before that, right? But akapanim, we see that we're struggling. I mean, like, this is clearly something that the Rashi and Tosafos are dealing with. Exactly what's the pshat in this strange sort of halachic ruling, and the specific words Tosafos and Rashi use. And in there lies the key, which I don't necessarily have. I feel like I'm grasping at it, but I'm touching around it, but not actually getting it. Upon him, I think I'm in the ballpark, and I wish I had like more questions to ask on this, which will hopefully jog us in the right direction. Okay, so that's going to get to the first story. Okay, everything's clear before we go to the next story? Anything that's not clear? Okay, so we're going to go to the next story. It's a short story, just 4 lines. And there's a long Rashi, a long Tosafos. It's long, but they're not very hard. It's very geschmack. And there's a shtickle that's going to back up Moshe Hirschhorn big time. That Rava is telling him to be a mensch. We're going to see the way Rashi learns, Mamish backs you up. And then we're going to see a Ritzvah, which really backs up the whole idea. So let's see. Says the Gemara. 4 lines from the top of the Mishnah. Runya Zovin Ara. Runya bought property on Mitzvah de Ravina at the border of Ravina's property. So Sover Ravina was of a mind, L'sluki Misham, to remove him from there. L'sluki, to remove him. Why? Misham Din de Bar Metzra, because he's a neighbor. You know the halach of a neighbor, that if I sell property to somebody else, there are different conditions, but let's just say it's a field, not a home, all kinds of conditions. Actually, recently in Rambam. So if I sell this field to somebody, my neighbor can come and pay the buyer out and remove him from the property. So Runya bought property neighboring Ravina, and Ravina was of a mind to oust him because he's a neighbor. So Amalei Rav Safra b'nei Rav Yeva, Rav Safra, son of Rav Yeva, said to Ravina, Amri Inchi, there's a common expression which is Arba Ltzalelא. 4 goes to the Tzala and 4 goes to the Tzalelא. So what exactly he's saying is up for debate. This is going to be, we have 3 different versions in Rashi, and then another version in Tosafos, 2 versions in Tosafos actually, giving us a total of 5 versions, maybe even more, because even in Tosafos you go from Maram Bar Marsha. But what exactly is he telling you? So let's see Rashi. Let's go through different pshat. One thing is clear, that Rav Safra is convincing Ravina to not remove Runya from the property he just bought. But what's the argument he's making? Why shouldn't he remove him? He has the full legal right to take it because he's a bar metzler, he's a neighbor. So says Rashi, Anisha Maiti, I heard that Tzala, what's a Tzala? Is a ratzon, shoemaker. Ani, a poor shoemaker. And Tzalala, with 2 lameds, is ratzon usher, is a wealthy shoemaker. Okay, so what's he saying? 4 goes to the cheap, poor shoemaker, and 4 goes to the rich shoemaker. What's he saying? And this is what Rav Safra is telling Ravina. Arba kikaris, 4 loaves of bread. Tzrichim l'ratzon ani. A poor shoemaker needs l'machalo is basic to feed his family, the yom per day. Kamosh tzrichim l'artzer, just like a rich man needs. In other words, rich and poor both need to eat. Whether there's a rich shoemaker or a poor shoemaker, they both require the same amount of food to feed their families. Now, v'zeh onu. Now, Runya is poor, and it seems like Ravina was rich. And as we learn more, we'll see that it seems like he was. But Runya is poor. V'zeh onu. This Runya is poor. And he needs this field to make a living. In other words, he needs to eat just as much as you need to eat. In the same way, you're coming to me telling him, leave this land. Bedina the bar metzra, because of the law of a neighbor. And where does the law of a neighbor come from? Mishum, the law of a neighbor comes from the pasuk which says, "Basisa yoshev atoiv," do that which is upright and proper. Be a mentioned business. That's what the Torah says. And one of the dinim we derive from this pasuk to be a mentioned business, it's a halacha of the neighbor. And therefore, if I wasn't a mensch and I sold the property to somebody else without first asking my neighbor can undo the sale because I wasn't a mensch. So you are now taking away the property from Runya because whoever sold it to Runya wasn't a mensch. So too, I'm telling you, says Rav Safra to Ravina, you should also be a mensch. La'ani zeh, to this poor guy, and don't kick him out of the property. So this is one simple pshat that Rav Safra is telling Ravina, using a metaphor of a poor and rich shoemaker. They both need to eat. Ravina, you're rich. You don't need a field to live. The Runya is poor. He needs the field. You're claiming a din that you have a right because the pasuk says to be a mensch. You be a mensch. Let him have the field. Let him make a living. Okay. Shot 1. Shot 2 says Rashi v'yesh legam game. We might poke. Gam games like to poke holes in this theory. Why? Because the leather karet tzala is called tzala. Loy ratza, not a shoemaker. Leather is called tzala, not shoemaker. Kedamina ba'alma, as the Gemara says elsewhere. Mar dargish. What's the definition of something called a dargish? A dargish is arsa the tzala, a leather bed. Arsa is a bed, tzala of leather. So you see that tzala means leather. Okay, so arbala tzala and arbala tzala would mean 4 for leather and 4 for leather with 2 lameds, whatever the difference between 1 lamed and 2 lamed is. So therefore, says Rashi, therefore I say, Runya Ratzon Hoya, he actually was a shoemaker. So he would purchase leather. And therefore, the Noisin Oilis Labdonim, he was a tradesman. So he would buy leather, give it and sell, and give the leather to Abdonim, to workers, Lasas Nehemanalin, to make shoes, Lamarchim B'Shuk, and to sell them in the market. So he would buy leather, pay people to make the shoes, and sell it in the market. This is what Rav Safra is telling him. This poor guy, this poor Runya, he makes very little profit. He has to pay a lot for the workers, the guys who work with leather. The Amri Inchi, because the expression is Arba Zuzi, you need to pay 4 zuz, to buy the actual leather. The Arba Zuzi, and another 4, l'schar abdonim, to pay for the action, you have to pay 4 zuz for the leather, and then another 4 zuz for the guy making the leather. Behind ltzalelא, and that's tzalelã. Tzalelã is the leather, and tzalelã is the guy working the leather. So you have to pay 8 zuz to produce 1 shoe. And how much can you sell a shoe for already? So it's it's not a lucrative business, very small margins. And therefore, therefore that would do that which is good and upright. And let this thing let this thing feed him. Okay. Now, at this point, from these 2 pirushim, would you say that Rav Safra is telling Ravina that min hadin, he has to leave, he has to give it to Runya? Absolutely not. Adin doesn't have to. But Rav Saf is telling him, Zaya Mensch. If that's the case, then this would explain why this story comes here. We're going to see in Tosafos, Tosafos is going to ask questions. One of them he's going to ask is, why is this story here, B'chlal? And if you're looking to bring stories about Runya and Ravina, why not bring the story of Runya and Ravina, the one I sent you in the WhatsApp from Bava Metzia, which we'll look at later. So which means that the Gemara is dafka bringing this story now. And L'chura, based on what Moshe said yesterday, we have the answer. Because yesterday we saw a story from Rava telling Runya to be a mensch. And now we have a story in the reverse where someone told Ravina to be a mensch. And the stories complement each other. The streets go all directions. One day Runya is a mensch to Ravina, and the next day Ravina is going to mention back to you. La dafka, do you always want to run to the strict letter of the law? Because one day it's not going to be to your benefit. And that would explain the flow of stories. Even though I'm still not clear on why Rava is giving legal advice to a defendant. But at least we see that there's a flow in the stories in Rashi's view. Certainly with Rashi's reading. Like, toiv loch lispayas, it's like, this would be a good thing for you to do. Not minadin, you have to. Minadin, you can come to court and then you'll lose. Toiv loch, it'd be good for you. Using this word, do that which is proper and upright. So it certainly would help the flow of the stories. But now comes another explanation. The linira. Now there's a little chester, I don't know if you have it, which goes to the Goy's Yunim. Basically, the Marshal writes that from here to the end is not Rashi speaking anymore. It's a Hagah from the Rashbam. That's what the Marshal writes, and they put it here in the Goy's Yunim. Yeah. And it would make sense because in this third one, it actually might be an inyan in din, not just the inyan of being a mensch. So says this Hagah, the linear that we're going to go at the Marshal and say it's a Hagah. The linear that seems to me, Dalat Ltzallah, that Dalat Ltzallah actually means Dalat Kikoris, 4 loaves of bread, going back similar to the first Pirush. Right? The first Pirush was that 4 is talking about 4 loaves of bread. That the rich shoemaker or the poor shoemaker both need 4 loaves of bread to feed their family. The second shot was that you need to pay 4 zuz for leather and 4 zuz for the leather workers, giving you very small margins on your shoe business. And that's why you should be nice to him. But both of them agreed, both the first 2 Perushim agreed, that he's a poor man, and Minadini doesn't deserve the field, but be a mensch and give him the field. And now comes a different shot. Going back to the first shot, that Dalal Ltzallah, that Taka 4 goes to the Tzallah, means Dalat Kikardas, 4 loaves of bread. Tzarech la'abdan, ani, does a shoemaker or a leather worker need, if he's poor, he needs 4 loaves of bread. The Dalat Tzallah, and likewise, 4 to Tzallah with 2 lamets, Kamoikin as well, Dalat Tzarech abdan asher. So instead of saying it's a ratzon, which is a shoemaker, he says abdan, a leather maker. Okay, so the poor leather maker and the rich leather maker both need 4 loaves of bread to feed their family. Umashal hu keneged runya, and it's being used metaphorically about runya. But he now connects it to the previous din, right? Till now, what's the relationship? Till now we know 2 things, right? We know for sure that Ravina had 4 fields around Runya. That we know. Now this field that Runya is buying, of which Ravina is saying, I'm a neighbor. Where is that field in relation to these 5 fields? So in the first 2 pshatim, we have no idea. Maybe it's a separate field Ravina has, and there's a separate field Runya is buying, unrelated to the fields of the previous story. But now he's attaching it to the fields of the previous story. Namely, Runya had 1 field amongst the 4 fields of Ravina. The Amalila, as we learned before, that Ravina surrounded Runya with 4 sides. Now, where's the field he's buying now? Now, he's buying a field that's on the border of Ravina, and Ravina's field breaks between his field in the middle and the field on the outside. So if you look at the picture I sent you, the diagram, it is, where is it? Just so you can visualize it, it's where it says number 1. Number one. So the question mark field, that's the field Ronya is buying, and Ravina is trying to take away. Yeah, so that's it. It's talking about that field. So now, where's my paper? Here it is. As you can see it here. Yeah. So now, back in Rashi, so this Hagar and Rashi, Rav Safra says to Ravina, do that which is right. Let him have that field, which is separated by your field, Ravina. The Akshav now, he'll have two fields. In the same way, he needs to guard two fields. It will suffice for one. In many different areas, the price of one field will be the same as the price of two fields. And you're helping Runya. Explain. So if you're looking at this picture, right? So he's got to pay for a guard to keep his fields. Is in the middle here, and this one here. But because they're so close, even though Ravina is in the middle, all he has to do is pay for one guard. Right? Whereas if he didn't have this field and he had to buy a field somewhere else, you have to pay for two. Right? The whole premise of Din de Bar Metzger is that because it's a neighboring field, it's very easy to just plow one through the other. For example, the halacha is, in Rambam recently, that if there are two fields next to each other and they're separated by a row of palm trees, so do I get the din of Bar Metzger? Can I claim that I deserve rights to my neighbor's field if I have a row of palm trees in between me? So it says that the halacha is that if there's enough that I can plow between the palm trees, then yes, I do have a claim to that neighbor. Why? Because the whole point of the neighboring thing is that it makes it easier for me to watch my properties. It makes me easier to plow my properties. I can do one plowing at once instead of one here, and then I have to pay for somebody else to go to some other place and plow it. So it says this version of Rav Safra that you'd be saving, Runya would also be getting a gain by having his fields close by, even though you're separating it. So even though he may not get the full benefit of a neighbor because he can't just plow straight through because Ravina's field is in the middle, but at least he wanted to pay for two guards. And he says, Mikama Dvarim, from many different areas, the cost of one is the same as the cost of two. In other words, you're paying for, you're paying for 50 yards or 100 yards, it's the same cost because it's just a general cost. But if you had it in two different places, it would cost you much more. Now, thinking it from this case, is Rav Safra making a legal argument or a biamenshlich argument? It's not clear, but one could argue that Rav Safra is making a legal claim because Runya has some claim as a bar metzger, maybe not as a full bar metzger, but some claim, and because he's poor, leave it to him. So I'm not going to say it's mamish min din, because that would be a huge chiddush to say that Rav Safra is paskening that a bar metzger counts even though there's a field break in middle. That would be a big chiddush, which is not in Rambam and probably nowhere else either. But to say it's completely out of the law of bar metzger, also not true. Because he dafka connects it by saying, how are you saving? In other words, the first two pshatim, why should Ravina let him have the field? So that this field can become more parnasa for him. This last pshat doesn't mention anything about Runya making more parnasa. It just says Runya is saving money by having the two fields close to each other. So even if it's not mamish din bar metzger, it's certainly a derivative of din bar metzger. So there's more legal claim here, not just be a mensch. But Rashi chooses to dafka taich the Gemara, both the Pirushim he gives, the Pirush he rejects and the Pirush he accepts, to be dafka where Rav Safra is telling him to be a mensch, which again supports what you were saying yesterday, that the two stories follow. Yesterday also Rav was saying to be a mensch. And now we're going to look in Tosafos and we're going to see where it's taka a legal claim. Rav Safra is taka making a legal claim, not a menschlich claim, which will further substantiate that Rashi is sticking his ground and saying, no, it's about being a mensch, not about making a legal claim. Okay, so I hope if it's not clear, please stop me because we're going to go to Tosafos now.
Just the end, it says he needs shmira for two fields.
Yeah. The same way you need to guard two fields, you also guard one. In other words, one guy can do both jobs if they're next door to each other. But if they're far away from each other, you have to pay two people, one here and one somewhere else. Right? I mean, the big question is, not the big question, but at least, well, this gets dicey because the previous story just said that Ravina already took care of the guarding because he built a wall around him. So I don't know what the problem is, but it's a little bit bothering me. Maybe when we get to the Marshal, we'll have an answer to this question. In other words, because the inside field already has a guard. It's been fenced in.
So basically, he's telling him he's going to have the economy of scale. He's going to save money by having
Exactly, which is the whole point of the Bar Metzer. The whole din of the Bar Metzer is you save this guy money by having his fields next to each other rather than forcing him to expand this property somewhere else. So it's not. I don't know if it's mamish. This is the din of the Bar Metzer that Runya has a legal claim as a Ben Metzer, but certainly it's within the scope of Ben Metzer, closer than just be a mensch because the guy is poor.
Right.
It's certainly not the same. Okay, so let's see now. Tosafos. Arba Letzaleh cholu. The פירוש HaKuntris, according to the פירוsh of Rashi, the Kuntris, Maksha Rabbeinu Tam asked the following question: Ha'ein merachem medin. We have a precedent, a rule in Gemara that you don't become merciful in din. This is a din in Torah, right? I shouldn't say this, but I don't know if this is where ein merachem medin comes from. But there is a din in the Torah that you're not supposed to say this guy's poor, so I'll judge him more favorably. A din is a din. A din is a din. So in the previous case, where Ravina was nisratz lakach, so I'm not being merachem medin. But however, nisratz lakach, or like Rashi says, or like Tosafos says, in lebish fil shekvar mispayis. But in this case, it's a din is a din, right? Number one.
I think in this week's parsha, no, talks
right.
about
Exactly. Yes, that's right.
So you're not supposed to favor the poor or the portion
right.
give less.
Exactly. So I don't know if ein merachem din comes from there, but it's the same thing. Yeah. Right. So we already learned in Rashi we're avoiding this question because Rashi is talking about the idea of being a mensch. It's before you went to Din Torah. In the same way, Rava is telling him to be a mensch before he comes to Din Torah. Rav Safra is telling him to be a mensch before he goes to Din Torah. So we already avoided l'chora Tosafos' question. But let's just go with Tosafos' way of reading Rashi, and that Rav Safra is actually telling him a din. Rav Safra is telling Ravina a din. I'm sorry, you don't have a claim to Bar Metzah because arba l'tzalelא. And l'chora ein merachem medin. So why would Rav Safra be paskening to Ravina that he doesn't have a claim to Bar Metzah? L'chora does. Okay, again, we avoided this by saying that Ravina is not, that Rav Safra is not giving him a psak, he's just telling him to be a mensch. Okay, so question number one on Rashi is l'chora ein merachem medin. Number two, v'oid, additionally, the Gemara says, Sava Ravina l'sluki. Ravina thought maybe I should remove him from the property so I can make claim to it because I'm a neighbor. Mashma, the implication is, Shetar Ravina, that Ravina made a mistake. That's B'chlal. Remember, we had this expression, Savar. We had it in Tosafos also about Lefichach way back in Daf Beis. Sivarua. Whenever the Gemara says Sivarua, Savar, it means I thought to do that, but it wasn't really the right thing to do. Implying that Minadin, Ravina was wrong. But according to Rashi, Minadin, he was correct. But Rav Safra is telling him, be a mensch. So this is a question that we don't have an answer yet to. Like, what does Savar mean? Unless you just go with Pashto, Savar means he thought, or he wanted to. Not that he was wrong. But anyway, upon him, this is his question. So that the language of Savar Ravina means he made a mistake, whereas L'chora, he was absolutely in his right to claim it because of his Bar Metzer, beyond being a mensch. Okay, but additionally, third question, and this question we also talked to answer. Ma Shayach Khan. What's the story in the Geya here? Hi Maisa. Why is the story coming in here about Bar Metzer? We're dealing with a case of building walls between neighbors. We're dealing with an issue of who pays for walls between neighbors. What's the ton of Bar Metzer? Where does Bar Metzer come in here? Ma Shayach Hi Maisa Khan. What's the story doing here? If the reason why it comes up here is because the Gemara often does. The Gemara, goes on a tangent, kiviyachol, where the Gemara introduces certain people, or the Gemara introduces a certain statement, and then the Gemara will go on in related statements. So maybe you're going to say the reason why the story is here is because we said a story about Ravina and Runya, so bring another story about Ravina and Runya. But says Tosafos, that's not good enough. Because if that's the case, then bring all the stories of Ravina and Runya. Le Sinami, bring also the story, Ma'aseh da Makabel, the story that's brought in Bava Metzia and Makabel. Runya Shetala de Ravina Hava. That Ravina was actually, this complicates the relationship. Runya was actually the artist. Runya was the sharecropper of Ravina. And the story in the Gemara there is, to look in the WhatsApp, the English there, read it in English very quickly. The Gemara relates that Runya was the planter of Ravina, he was the artist. He caused the loss. Runya made a mistake and the property, he caused the loss in the property. And Ravina removed him from his field, he fired him. Runya came before Rava and said to him, let the master see what Ravina has done to me. He made me lose my job, he threw me out. Rava said to him, to Runya, Ravina did well, because you caused him loss, so you get fired. Runya said to him, but Ravina didn't warn me beforehand that I would lose my job. How can he force me to leave without prior warning? So Rava said to him, in this case, it is not necessary to provide any warning. And the Gemara was on to say that Rava is l'taimei, which is that whenever there's a loss that can't be recuperated, there's no such thing as warning. You know the stakes. If you're going to cause somebody else loss of money, you might get fired. No one has to warn you in advance. Okay, so if we're here bringing stories of Runya and Ravina, why not bring that story also? And Tosafos goes even further. And these two stories of Runya and Ravina, these two stories, the Shmaitin of our Gemara, why not bring those stories there? So if that's the Gemara brings one story there and two stories here, it means these two stories are Nageya here. Okay? Now we already answered this question by saying that the two stories go together because the Gemara is making this point that this is the idea of being a mensch. And it goes both ways. First, Rava tells Runya to be a mensch, and then the next story, Rav Safra tells Ravina to be a mensch. So we kind of answered this question also. Now, additionally, the tzala is leather. Like the Gemara says, my dargish, what is this thing called a dargish? Arsa the tzala, a leather bed. So we see tzala is leather. So it seems from this Tosafos, that from this question, that Tosafos only had the first pshat in Rashi, which Rashi rejected for this very same reason. Right? Rashi himself said this. But anyway, the other questions still apply even to the second pshat in Rashi. Okay, so let's see Tosafos' answer. So Tosafos basically needs to come up with this idea that it has to be a halachic discussion, and the halachic discussion has to be related to the previous story. Because if it's not a halachic discussion, then we're being merachim b'din, and we're not allowed to do that. We can't be merachim b'din, which means Rav Safra said he had a claim to bar metzer, and he was wrong about it. And I'm sorry, Ravina said he had a claim to bar metzer, and he was savar. He thought he had it, but he was wrong. And Rav Safra told him, you don't have a claim to it. So in the words of Arba'ah La'Tzallah, Rav Safra has to be undermining Ravina's claim to the field. So how is that? Says Tosafos. Rabbi Tam says, the Zavan Ara Amitzah Ravina. That Runya bought property on the border of Ravina's property. Hainu, this is Ametzer Oisem Sodas Akafi Ravina Ma'abra Chaysev. This is on the other side of the four fields that Ravina had surrounding him, like figure 1 in our picture. Same thing as the Haggah in Rashi, right? He's looking to buy that field, which is separated by Ravina's field. So now we already see the connection to the previous story, because we're talking about the same fields. Okay. So now what happens is, sorry. He was buying property he was buying property on the borders of Ravina's field. That is that very field. In other words, the Gemara is giving us now the backstory of how Runya bought that field in the middle. So the story now comes actually before the previous story. The previous story was after Ravina owned that property in the middle. Right? But now the Gemara is telling us how Runya acquired that property. So how is that? on the border of that very field, that Ravina had surrounded him on both sides. And therefore, Ravina Matzim Gimel Rochais. Ravina was a neighbor on 3 sides. Verunya Meruach Achas. And Runya was a neighbor on 1 side. Okay? How's that? And that is figure 2. Look at figure 2, and you'll see. So Runya owns that field, and Ravina has 4 fields all around. So this field right here with the question mark, Runya is a neighbor on 1 side, whereas Ravina is a neighbor on 1, 2, 3 sides. And in the previous story is only after Runya owned the whole thing in the middle. And that's when Ravina put the 4 walls up. And that's when he made the claim. Right? So L'chatchila, he only surrounded him on 3 sides. There was another field belonging to somebody else. Ravina has 3 neighboring properties to that property in the middle, whereas Runya has 1. But now they're equal bar metzres. They both have din of bar metzah. They both have claim as neighbors. Ravina from 3 sides and Runya from 1. Okay, so it says in Tosafos now. Where are we? Now, Africa, the Omar Makabo, even though the Gemara says in Bava Mitzvah, Hani Arba B'nei Matri. If 4 people are neighbors of 1 property, the Kodam Chad Minay Zovan, and one of the 4 buys the property, Maida Zovan, whatever he bought. In other words, I can't claim Bar Metzer from the neighbor on the other side. We're all neighbors, we all have equal claim. So if I buy the field as a neighbor, the other neighbor on the other end can't come take it away from me. So if so, what's Rav Safra's claim here? What's Ravina's claim here? Runya is also a neighbor. And there's the mistake. Ravina thought to say, was looking to remove Runya from that property, because he was a neighbor on 3 sides. And Runya was only on 1 side. And that's why he thought he had a claim. So now we already see that there's a legal claim to Rav Safra. There's a legal claim to Runya. Rav Safra thought to remove Runya because he thought he had a better claim because he's a neighbor on 3 sides, but he was wrong. So how is it that Rav Safra expressed that Ravina was wrong by saying Arba Ltzallah? So says Tosafos. So Amar Rav Safra tells Ravina, Amri Inchi, people say Arba Ltzallah, 4 you pay for tzala. Tzala, Tosafos already established earlier, means leather. So פירוש לא for leather, gadol if it's big leather. If you buy a big piece of leather and you give it to someone to work it, to what's there's a word for it, to a tanner, right? Tanner. If you give it to the tanner, it's going to cost you 4 zuz. And whether you have a small leather, it's interesting that Tosafos makes the 2 lameds small, whereas in the other Pirushim, the 2 lameds were bigger. But anyway, point is the same. So whether you give the tanner a big piece of leather, or whether you give him a small piece of leather, it's a flat rate of 4 zuz. So how does this counterclaim Ravina's argument? How is that a marshal to argue against his legal claim that I'm a neighbor on 3 sides, whereas you're only a neighbor on 1? Means to say, you see that there's this expression that you have to pay out whether you're doing something small or doing something big. Meaning to say, there's the same effort to do the tanning work on a big piece of leather as on a small piece of leather. And that's why you charge the same flat rate, because you have to do the same work. You still have to put it into all the same material, all the same chemicals. You still have to do the same work. It happens to be an extra ½ an inch. What's the difference? The work is the same. So I'm here too. My time did a bar metzra. What's the point of a bar metzra? The point of bar metzra is to give the neighbor the right to have all of his fields near each other, so he can plow them out all at once. And to that end, what's the difference if you're a neighbor on 3 sides or 1 side? The work is the same. The work gained is the same. This expression about leather is, no matter how big your leather is, the work the tanner has to do is the same, and therefore the cost is the same. Well, here he's saying also, the work gained by having a field that's on 1 side of you, or 3 sides of you is the same. The point is, your field became bigger. Now you can do make it 1 big field. So what's the difference if you're making a 1 big field because you have 3 sides, or making a 1 big field because you have 1 side? The claim is the same. So Rabbi, so you see here, Rabbi Tam is clearly different than Rashi. Rashi is clearly saying it's an issue of Zaya Mensch. Whereas Tosafos is saying, Rabbi Tam is saying it's a claim of Pasha halachic claim. It's a halachic argument. And if Safar made a mistake, Savar, he made a mistake. Okay. So Shmak a little back and forth here. But I think we did a good job at defending Rashi. Answered pretty much all of Tosafos' questions, I think. Except for the word Savar, which Tosafos says Savar means he made a mistake. But you don't have to say that. You have to go through all of Shas and see if every time the word Savar comes up, it means he made a mistake. So the Pasha Savar, which means he meant to do that. No, he wanted to. No. Doesn't mean he made a mistake in halacha claim. Okay. Before we go to this next pshat in Tosafos, I want you to look at the last picture I sent you. The Ritzvah, which Mamish makes our case. Ritzvah writes, Nidali Yasha Pirush Hazeh. We might suggest to defend this Pirush, meaning the Pirush of Rashi. He's being told to be merciful. Mishum Laman Telech B'derech Tovim V'orchat Tzadikim. So he should go in an up and proper way of Tzadikim. Tishmar. It's a pasuk.
Where is this?
The Ritzvah, the third picture I sent you today. The Ritzvah. Nearly the Yasha Pirush Hazeh Dachlichu Linig by Midas Rachmanis. Mishum from a pasuk which says Laman Telech B'derech Tovim V'orchat Tzadikim Tishmar. Yehi the Perek Umnin, as we see present elsewhere. But Ravina Savlos Luke B'Shleishim Gimgum. When Ravina wanted to remove him, he wanted to move him without any opposition, no halachic opposition to his claim. Dechshash, I think it's supposed to say chshash, not the tashash. Dechshash isser. There was absolutely nothing wrong with Ravina's claim. I think it's shaper kavod, it's supposed to say, or something. I'm not sure what this word is. But we see the point here is that the Ritzvah is substantiating what we're saying here, that it's Takar, Ravina wasn't making a mistake, he had a full legal claim, and yet he was telling him to be a mensch. And in this way we answered all our questions, because if Taka were right in learning that yesterday, and maybe that's the difference between Tosafos and Rashi's language from yesterday. Rashi's language somehow indicates that Rav is telling him to be a mensch. Because he's willing to take it, it's good for you to go with it. Be a mensch. Whereas Tosafos says, meaning to say, because he's karnas bias, the din is you give him less. So maybe Taka would extend the machlekes to yesterday also. That Tosafos is saying that yesterday was also an inyan in din, that so the karnas bias changes the din. Whereas Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi just says toivlach. Because meaning it's an inyan of being a mensch, inyan of being lefnim din, not an inyan of actual din. But maybe Tosafos is saying it's inyan din also, both yesterday and today. Okay, let's finish the Tosafos. Another pshat.
And gamgum again is?
Really gimgum, without any blemish, without any defect. Actually, we're going to put we'll look at the last part of Tosafos next week. It's very geschmack. We're going to see there's another picture I sent you there from, I think, Marashba. And we're going to see a machlekes Mardam and, no, not machlekes actually, but we're going to see an interesting marsha about this last pshat in Rabbi Avram, and we'll leave it for now because I don't want to rush it. We don't want to rush that. Okay. So I hope if it's not clear, please ask questions. Okay, I'll get to Nacht.
Good to know.
Thank you. Ciao.